Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Underneath. It's Cale Zeldin here, and I wanted to do a little check-in. Been thinking a lot about um, being a public figure in the age of profilicity, social media, and the constraints of the Dunbar number, and the ways in which profilicity and social media jam that figure up. Now, the Dunbar number is named after, I think his name is Aaron Dunbar. He's an English social scientist. And he talks about there's a sort of a hard cap on the number of people that you can have uh, stable relations with. And I think it's helpful to understand this as a sort of a series of layers. There's the sort of the super close friends, which is about three, a close knit group at about 15, and then he settles on this number, and maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's a little bit less, of about 150. That you can have about 150 people that you can have a kind of meaningful social relationship with, and the outer contours of that hover around 500. And, you know, I want to specifically think about this in the context of um, social media, influencers, and the interesting stories that we're hearing, especially for those who are, let's say, younger than around 40, maybe late millennials, and maybe all millennials, and certainly the Zoomers. As a teacher, I am limited by time and space, right? I have about 20, let's call them sets of eyes at any given time in a classroom, in a section, between 15 and 20. And maybe if I address the assembly, it's about 350 to 400 people. And so there are real kind of physical limitations of time and space that I have in my capacities as a teacher. And of course, as a teacher, I am instructing, but I am influencing. I'm sort of a public figure in some interesting ways. But what if our technologies allow us to soar well beyond the physical limitations, the number limitations? What does it mean if I have not 20 sets of eyes on me or 350 sets of eyes on me, but I have multiple thousands? What if, and I don't, but what if I had on Instagram, 75,000 followers or 150,000 followers, not to mention those upper strata of millions and millions of followers? What does that do to you? And certainly, what does it do for your audience? And because I live and move and have my being in a physical space, in a classroom, at a school, it keeps me kind of. Um, um, there are certain guardrails that are established around me, that I live in a meet space in real life. I have certain inbuilt limitations, and I would say that for my experience, the Dunbar number kind of checks. It makes a decent amount of sense. Now, what if I were a traveling teacher or a traveling performer? So that I go from Providence to Boston to Albany to Cincinnati to Chicago, to St. Paul. If I'm on some kind of tour, what does that do to my reach? Well, obviously, it extends my reach because I am moving beyond my home base here in Rhode Island, and I'm going into a new group of people time and time again. I think about this for traveling preachers and traveling teachers and traveling rock bands. I had a conversation a few weeks back with a good friend, Christian Baxter. Um, I think of the Yours Truly podcast. Link down in the show description if you're interested in that. And in our conversation, we were talking about those kind of realities for someone who travels and who does his thing outside of his local space. And he pointed me to an interesting conversation that Chris Williamson had on his Modern Wisdom podcast. Again, link below in the show notes. And he had a conversation with a band, I think it was called Under Oath. And they were talking about the kind of strange reality that they live in, with, the difference between being on tour and being at home with their wives and their families. And you know, they experience the sort of the disconnect between being this traveling show, this persona on stage, with their lived realities at home, and there are certain real challenges to that lifestyle, to that person. What is real, because you have, through virtue of technologies and transportation, you have in one sense conquered time and space. That's what our technologies allow us to do. You've conquered time and space, you've extended your sort of social circles, but there's a kind of fiction to that. There's a surreality to it, a para reality that, those who make their living in that kind of way can talk with each other, and there's a deep experiential quality to that disconnect that most of us just don't experience. Now, with the advent of social media, that those limitations are are exploded. There aren't real limitations beyond, your follower count. So if you have the ability to amass a large following on YouTube, or on X or on Instagram, you are blown well beyond those normal limitations that normal people have to go through. And what if, and so for those of us who grew up as non-digital natives, the Gen Xers and the Boomers amongst us, for most of us, that this new reality of the jacked Dunbar number is new, right? And so we have an experiential, lived experience of those limitations. And so even for those of us who play around with social media and with these platforms, we recognize that what happens in social media space, even, can we call it a space in the same way? Can you have a bodiless space? I think is an open question. But what if you are a digital native? What if you are a millennial? You grew up on your phone, and that's the only kind of blended reality that you know. I've been thinking about this, especially in light of, in the online Catholic space. There was a guy a few days back who goes under the moniker of Voice of Reason. And he got into some hot water because there were some screenshots that were leaked, that intimated that he was leveraging his social media success, to slide into people's DMs and to carry on these strange, um, mediated relationships with a variety of girls. And there was even insinuation, although who knows if it's true or not, that in his capacities as a kind of small time celebrity catechist and apologist, that he may have even had an inappropriate relationship with an underage girl. But it's not really my point here. I'll let the folks settle that out. Of course, all of this is alleged, right? But what strikes me, when I think of this, and is that, you know if you are 26, let's say 25, 26, 27, you only know a world that is mediated through your social media accounts. In my capacities, I work at a boarding school. I see my own students struggle with this. You're carrying on a relationship of some sort vis-a-vis your phone on Snapchat or Instagram, and you can get very intimate very quickly. And I don't mean anything necessarily untoward, but you can get extremely intimate, um, um, working the instant message on those particular apps, and then you have to kind of see that person in meet space, in real life, at the dining hall, in the classroom. And I can see them struggling mightily, especially, if you're verbally fluid vis-a-vis texting, you can get very deep very quickly with people, and in a way that once you sort of get together in real life, it's all very confusing. You know, when I was a kid, of course, we had a telephone, and you could certainly generate a kind of intimacy with another person on the telephone, but we could not carry out whole relationships just on the phone. But in the era of Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and all these things, you really can. And I think it poses a particular kind of challenge for those young people who've never had to or been forced to carry on a relationship in meat space. And so you've got this voice of reason guy. Several months back, you had this Democrat influencer by the name of Harry Sisson, and he was accused of carrying on multiple relationships with multiple young women who were shocked to find out that he had a roster. That is a series of girls that he was getting incredibly intimate with, and maybe even sharing nudes and those kinds of things. And again, for people in my generation, like, this is just kind of weird, especially if you're married. I suppose if you're not married, maybe this is part of your new um, social imaginary that you can carry on with a number of different people romantically on these apps. But you know, how is this different from the old stories of the rocker who would go on tour, and not only would he have groupies, but he would have different girlfriends in different cities, or in a sailor back in the day having different girlfriends in all the different ports of call. um, but with social media, everybody can sort of become a rock star. Everybody can become a sailor who goes from town to town to town, because you don't even have to leave the comforts of your own phone. And is it different? I don't know, effectively, but I do know that in terms of your ability to carry on with multiple people at the same time through your phones poses a unique challenge. And so, how does this new trans physical, phone mediated social media world form you as a person? You know, if all of these things are now possible, do you even appreciate them as being, different than those kinds of relationships that you would carry on, at the local bar or the local meetups, or wherever it is you go? And so, how are you, as the social media influencer, as the rock star, particularly vulnerable to these kinds of temptations? And how are these marks, these people that you are carrying on with, how are they particularly vulnerable? What exactly are the boundaries? What are the stays against potentially psychopathic behavior? Um, what are the guardrails in this new social media landscape? And as a way of, I think, trying to understand this, I find the concept of profilicity to be helpful, because the concept of profilicity, as um, explained or coined or explored by Hans Georg Mueller and Paul J. D'Ambrosio, they have this concept of profilicity. And I'm going to read a kind of definition that I found through their work, and it's profilicity is a contemporary mode of identity formation that differs from earlier paradigms of sincerity and authenticity. In profilicity, identity is constructed and expressed through the curation of public profiles. And here, think social media accounts. Um, expressed through the curation of public profiles, primarily shaped by how individuals are perceived by an abstract audience. Because remember, the audience that you have like this through YouTube is for the person projecting a signal. My audience is abstract. They're not here right now in front of me like they would be in the classroom or at an assembly. They are not even happening in real time, right? This is not a live streamed video, which can sort of create a sense of immediacy. But this is recorded and it'll be uploaded, and you're watching this sometime after I'm offering you these remarks. So my audience is abstract. Now, I know a lot of you in the comments, we interact, and that's all fun and good. But in the real time of recording something like this, you, my audience, are an abstraction. And so my audience, then, my abstract audience, is referred to as a kind of general peer. And they go on to say that this process relies on second order observation. In other words, I am observing myself as others might observe me. Rather than adhering to traditional social roles, like in the ages of sincerity or the modes of sincerity, or expressing a unique inner self in the mode of authenticity, profelicity is of a different sort, and it requires this second order processing. And they offer 5 kind of bullet point takeaways to explore this idea of profelicity. So it's a curated identity. In other words, this is fabricated. It is made up in some way. I mean, I'm a real person, and this is a real shirt, and these are real glasses, and this is a real barn that I'm recording in. But this is being consciously done. It's fabricated like a stage show. Secondly, it requires second order observation. I am conscious in talking here to the camera. I am conscious of how I might be perceived. Now, I could be wrong about that. Maybe I am, but I'm conscious that my abstract audience is perceiving me in some capacity. And so I am careful in terms of how I am now curating my appearance. There's a kind of contextual flexibility, they go on to say. This is the third point. Um, there are multiple contexts, but these are context dependent personas. So if I'm known as like the old books guy, or if I'm known as the rock star, if I'm known as the traveling poet, or if I'm known as the traveling social media influencer for the Democratic Party in the case of Henry Sisson, or if I'm known as the kind of traveling Catholic apologist and catechist, that is context dependent. And so people know me exclusively in my capacities as a public figure. I am known exclusively in that way. So all the other stuff that you don't see, my normal day-to-day routines, those are filtered out, and all you get is this signal that I am projecting through my camera right now and up into YouTube. All right, so it is context. There's flexibility, contextual flexibility. Um, and of course, there's the added dynamic of social validation. Back in the day, I might get socially validated by applause. I might be socially validated by people shaking my hand after a show or a performance or a class. I get that. When I have a particularly good class, you can kind of feel that dynamic in real time in meet space. And when you're on it, right? You're hitting your marks, and everything is flowing, and these words that you're saying are somehow magically popping into your head. The spirit of the moment has caught you and is sort of using you as a kind of instrument to say these kinds of things. But in this context, in the age of profelicity through social media, it takes the form of likes and retweets and interactions in the comments section, or if I'm live streaming, it's the hive mind happening in the live chat, right? And lastly, this sense of profelicity, there are non-digital roots. I can have in-person appearances, or I can appear on another person's context. And so when I'm thinking of this, um, this voice of reason fellow, I can see all of these markers of profelicity. And the guy is good at what he does. He's really good at explaining, the tenets of Catholic catechism, of offering apologetics, and he has a certain amount of charisma, with his audience. And as a young, attractive, intelligent, young man, he is able to transmit his profile in a way that is meaningfully felt by his audience. And so, what what are the particular temptations for this kind of interaction? Everybody wants to be loved. Everybody likes to be loved. And so, what if your inbox is flooded with young girls who love your work and want to get intimate with you, and maybe not even explicitly sexually, but they just want to reach out? I know that there are certain online personas that I know that I would love to have extended conversations with, share a beer with, and I think that any of us who are playing in this particular sandbox um, understand that you are jacking that kind of potential experience, that kind of an imaginal experience in which I can have real, meaningful conversations with it. And what if I don't have any sense of proper boundaries? Well, I think you can see that you can play around with this. And so, this voice of reason fellow, Alex Gerardo, I believe is his name, um, he goes on a bigger platform like someone like Matt Fradd, and there he is. And Matt Fradd is a professional. He's good at what he does. He's a first-rate podcaster and interviewer. And there they are, and they're in this beautiful set. It's well lit. The cameras are crispy. And everything is perfect. The sound is great. And there you are. You're smoking a cigar, and Matt is smoking a cigar and he's asking you these questions. And you can't help that reality of that second order observation that you are actively striking a pose, as the old Madonna lyric goes. You are playing a role, you're playing a part. And all Hollywood actors and Hollywood actresses understand that on some level, they are making an abstract audience fall in love with them. They are making love to the camera. And, this has been the undoing of many a people. Marilyn Monroe, like, what's the difference between Marilyn Monroe and Norma Jean? What is it? I think that movie Notting Hill with um, Julia Roberts and, oh, what's that English? Hugh Grant. Hugh Grant. And that story is about an actress who falls in love with an unsuspecting, handsome guy who runs a bookstore in Notting Hill in London. And there's that famous scene where she says, I'm just a girl, who's coming before you today, and she craves a kind of real interaction with another real person, and she suspects that it is an almost insurmountable obstacle for him to overcome the fact that he knew her before he knows her in this way. And so it generates all kinds of questions of epistemology. How do we know, and what do we know? And this hyper narrow sense of epistemology needs to be built back out into the sort of the multiple ways of knowing. And again, so I'm thinking of this guy who has apparently been living a double and triple and quadruple life vis-a-vis the apps on social media. Someone who has sort of carefully curated this public persona as someone who can eloquently speak um, all the right words. Um, what if you know all the right words to say? You're an up and coming apologist. You know all the verbal moves. You know how to look at the camera in such a way. You know how to take a puff on your cigar, in theory, and make it look oh so attractive. And in fact, I think you recognize that you are a kind of wizard with words, and you are well on your way to becoming an accomplished caster of spells. But maybe you are an apprentice. I'm reminded of the story of the sorcerer's apprentice who knows the right words and knows how to summon this power, yet doesn't really know how to control it. And so the apprentice, casts the spell, and it causes a big mess. And the older, accomplished wizard has to come and take care of the mess that you have wrought with your spell casting. And so incumbent on the kind of power that a wizard has is a sort of a greater sense of wisdom. When is it appropriate? What are the guardrails? What are the limitations? Do you understand, or do you know yourself enough that you can have 150,000 followers on Instagram and not abuse it? And I think we should be, on the one hand, understanding that when you all of a sudden um, you're 25 and you've been highly successful. You have jammed that Dunbar number. We're not talking about 150 people. We're talking about 150,000 people who think they know you, and so they pop into your DMs, and so you carry on, and you're vulnerable and lonely because you're this public persona. They're vulnerable and lonely because they're a rando on the internet, and you can kind of carry on this way. And I think that people my age and older look at social media, look at these various platforms as kind of cool additions to the normal life that they lead. Um, but but for younger millennials and Zoomers, they've only known this kind of hybrid reality in which you know they do not appreciate their phones as kind of cool add-ons, but rather they only know a world that has been fully penetrated and intermingled with these social technologies. And these social technologies are so hyper powerful. We have very little appreciation for just how powerful they really are. And so, you might say that the person who never leaves the walled garden is kind of operationally naive, because the levels of temptation for relative to a normal person who lives outside the walls is small, and so their kind of temptations are probably primarily spiritual in nature. I would say that all temptation is primarily spiritual, but we all know that none of us have a firm sense of how we might react to temptation until we are confronted with real temptation. And who knows the kind of temptations that come your way when you have 150,000 or more followers on one of these social media platforms. You know, um, um, Again, I think rock stars, traveling musicians, traveling entertainers have a kind of sense of this, because you go to each city, each town, each venue, and you've got, you know, several thousand people, eyes locked in on you. And, what must that be like? Well, I would imagine it would be pretty strange and off putting. Um, because the limitations that we experience in real life in meat space just simply don't afford most of us those kinds of opportunities. So there is, in one sense, I have a certain amount of compassion for these young people who find themselves all of a sudden very internet famous. Um, so, what is the role of wisdom, and who might perform that role for you? Because an old guy or an old gal might only have a couple of hundred followers on the internet. And so you might be tempted to say, like, well, what do those bros know? They don't know anything. I've got 150,000, 200,000, a million followers on YouTube or Instagram. And those peculiar kinds of temptations come at you before you have enough operational experience, wisdom, to deal with those kinds of temptations. And so one wonders, does a psychopath find the platform and act out their psychopathic tendencies online in virtual space and social media space, or does it turn you into one? And I do think that there's a certain baseline of psychopaths in the population. It's a sort of a microscopic number, if my reading is any way to be trusted in this regard. But by jacking the Dunbar number vis-a-vis social media, it very well might malform your expectations about what is real, and who is real, and what you can get away with. Um, because in the strange intimacy that is created by our phones, an intimacy that is not really the same kind of intimacy that we have in real life, what does that do to a person? Well, what it appears to do to some people is that it makes you or affords you the opportunity to work on your worst impulses. And so where exactly is that sub personality of your conscience? And how powerful is that conscience if it doesn't know any better, that it has always been formed in the context of digital space, this interpenetrated world where you have access to people in ways that our forebears, 20 years ago, wouldn't even dream as possible. So the strange thing, of course, is that you know uh, the difference between movies and television and social media is that social media allows all of us to become rock stars. And so, what do you do with that newfound power? Do you use it for good? Do you take opportunities as they come along? I would imagine that that temptation is a real one. Um, and it is a temptation that is only going to get worse as these young people have no experience outside of the world they live in. And as I said earlier, those of us who are older come to the social media thing, these platforms, having already been formed by the limitations of time and space. But if this is all you know, how do you know what is normal or not? And I'm sure I'm going to get tons of comments like, "Okay, Unc, okay, Boomer, you can prattle on about this all you want, but this is what is real." And I'm not so sure about it. I mean, it's real in terms of it's happening, but how real are the interactions that we have with each other, um, fully mediated by zeros and ones, fully mediated by this medium, this digital medium that has co-opted time and space. So when it comes to these young guys who are taking advantage of their internet fame, their Instagram fame, um, I am sympathetic. But at the same time, you might look for some kind of mentor. You're an apprentice. You might look for some kind of mentor to check in and say, "Am I being real right now? Am I taking advantage of it? Is this how I want to be known?" And as we know, all will be made known in the light of day. And so even our activities online. And not sure how we're going to negotiate this moving forward, but I do know that old wisdom is really necessary for us as we try to navigate these new powerful elements of our social imaginary. So if you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. Thanks for your time and attention. I do my best not to bore you, not to waste your time. So until next time, cheers and God bless.